Welcome back to the Open Ground. This is the second video in our Mytho-Poetic Philosophy playlist. Eventually, we hope to establish, in a peripheral manner, playlists that showcase the Perpetualist philosophy across all modalities of thought. I hope you enjoy. Let's get into it. Meta-reflection. What follows is an attempt to articulate something that resists articulation, the recursive tension between structure and interference. The very act of naming these forces risks ossifying them into concepts when they function as conditions. This exploration proceeds with awareness of its own contradictions, seeking not resolution but sustained engagement with what cannot be resolved. As usual, we begin from there. Anank and Eltheria, a Perpetualist Reckoning with Causality. Section 1. The Lineage of Anank. Before the gods had names, there was Anank, not a goddess in the modern sense, not a personality, not a will. Ananke predates Olympus. She predates narrative. She emerges not from the stories of mortals, but from cosmogony itself. The deep intuition that something binds all becoming. That even the gods, in their caprice and chaos, are not free. But to speak of her this way, as primordial, as foundational, already risks the very systematization that perpetualism must refuse. The moment we place Ananka before or beneath, we have made her into metaphysical furniture. We have given structure a home outside of relation. Let me recalibrate. Ananke is not prior to experience. She is the pattern that emerges when experience recognizes its own conditioning. She is what we call the persistent return of structure, not as external law, but as the recursive pressure that makes each moment's possibilities finite. In the Orphic tradition, Ananke coils around the world egg with Chronos. Together they crack the beginning open, not with violence or command, but with inevitability. This is crucial. Ananka does not act. She necessitates. She makes motion irreversible, choices compulsory, causes binding. Yet even here, in reaching for ancient wisdom, I feel the pull toward false solidity. The Greeks knew something about necessity, yes, but their Ananke was embedded in a cosmos we no longer inhabit. Can their insight survive translation into a world where necessity operates through algorithms, genetic codes, and trauma responses? Or am I constructing a lineage that serves my argument more than truth? The honest answer, both. And this is precisely where perpetualism must hold tension rather than resolve it. The Greeks placed her above Zeus. The Stoics folded her into their logos. The Neoplatonists saw her in the chain of emanation. But she does not remain in myth. She reincarnates, again and again, as the hidden force behind every system that claims inevitability. In Laplace's Demon, where perfect knowledge renders the future entirely determined. In Spinoza, where freedom becomes understanding necessity. In Marx, where material conditions script historical unfolding. In Darwin, where selection operates without telos, only survivability. In Freud, where childhood patterns encode adult repetition. In machine learning, where behavior is modeled, predicted, optimized. In trauma, where the nervous system encodes threat, and the past arrives before the present is processed. Ananke is no longer a deity. She is a distributed condition, a recursive pattern. She is the architecture behind action, not the rule book, but the condition that makes rules necessary. And yet, she remains as invisible as she is inescapable. The modern mind does not worship her, but it obeys her. Every time we say, I had no choice, every time we reduce thought to cause, action to incentive, emotion to chemistry, justice to outcome. But here, I must pause. Am I not doing the same thing? Reducing the complexity of causation to the figure of Ananke. Perpetualism demands that I acknowledge this risk without abandoning the attempt. The goal is not conceptual purity, but disciplined engagement with what exceeds our categories. To name Ananke is not to capture her essence. It is to develop a vocabulary for recognizing the recursive patterns that shape recognition itself. And this recognition changes the conditions under which those patterns operate. Which brings us to her counterpart, not her opposite, but her recursion. Section 2. The political birth of Eltheria. If Ananka is the recursive pressure of structure, Eltheria is what emerges when structure becomes capable of interference with itself. But she is not transcendence. She is immanent complication. Her name enters history not as philosophy, but as political demand. The refusal of tyranny, the claim to autonomy. In democratic Athens, she was not abstract ideal, but civic practice. Freedom from enslavement, but never freedom from order. She was law grounded in self-rule, not liberty against constraint. The Greeks were precise here in ways we have forgotten. Eleutheria was not the rejection of necessity, but the possibility that the conditions of necessity could be, in part shaped through collective deliberation. This is already recursion, the system modifying the conditions of its own operation. Yet, I wonder, am I romanticizing Athens to serve a theoretical point? Democratic Athens also practiced slavery, excluded women, and built its freedom on the unfreedom of others. The very concept of Eleutheria was bounded by who counted as capable of self-rule. This is not incidental. It reveals how even liberatory concepts carry the recursive imprint of the conditions that birthed them. Perpetualism cannot ignore this. If we are to think with Eleutheria, we must think with her contradictions, not around them. Later, she is reabsorbed by Rome as libertas, transfigured into status more than self-determination. The Stoics attempt to preserve her by redefining freedom as alignment with necessity. But this is already a quiet capitulation. Freedom becomes rationalized acceptance rather than structural interference. The Enlightenment tries again. Locke, Rousseau, Kant. Each attempts to ground Eleutheria in reason, will, moral universality. But what they inherit is the illusion of the self-caused subject, the fantasy that freedom means independence from conditioning. This is where Eleutheria fractures into ideology. The atomized individual, the sovereign will, the choice unconditioned by circumstance, these become the founding myths of liberalism. And these myths, however noble in intention, generate their own forms of recursive blindness. Modern neuroscience, psychology, and computation converge to expose this fiction. We are not free in the classical sense. Our preferences are scripted, our memories plastic, our decisions predictable. The sovereign subject dissolves under examination. And yet, even knowing this, we hesitate, we deliberate, we revise, we reflect. In that recursion, Eleutheria persists, not as metaphysical liberty, but as the emergent property of systems capable of modeling their own conditioning. Freedom becomes not exemption from causality, but the capacity for self-modifying participation in causal unfolding. This is measurable. How many iterations of reflection before reaction? How many competing frameworks can the mind hold without collapse? How much structural feedback can the system endure while maintaining coherence? Freedom becomes a matter of recursive capacity, not the power to step outside structure, but the ability to participate consciously in structure's recursive modification of itself. But here I must ask, am I redefining freedom to make it compatible with determinism? Is this genuine insight or a conceptual sleight of hand? Perpetualism demands that I hold this question open rather than rushing to closure. What I can say is this: Eleutheria, as I am attempting to articulate her, is not the solution to the problem of Ananke. She is what happens when Ananke becomes visible to itself. And this visibility changes everything, not by transcending structure, but by complicating it recursively. Section 3. The failure of reconciliation and why perpetualism refuses it. Every major philosophical system has attempted to reconcile necessity and freedom. Every attempt has failed by flattening one term, distorting the other, or evacuating both of force. But let me be honest about what I am doing here. By calling these attempts failures, am I not claiming a superior vantage point? Am I not suggesting that perpetualism succeeds where others have failed? This is precisely the kind of systematization that perpetualism must resist. So let me recalibrate. These are not failures, but structural limitations. Each system reveals something true about the tension between Ananke and Eleutheria, while necessarily obscuring other dimensions. The question is not whether they failed, but what their limitations teach us about the irreducible difficulty of thinking recursively. Theological systems place sovereignty in the divine. Human will is preserved only as obedience. Freedom becomes submission, and Ananke is hidden behind providence. This preserves agency by deferring it, but it cannot account for the recursive effects of this deferral on the conditions of belief itself. Rationalist ethics declare freedom to be rational self-determination, but reason itself is a conditioned structure. Autonomy becomes coherence, and Eleutheria becomes indistinguishable from systematic thinking. The system cannot think its own conditioning without threatening its own foundations. Compatibilism claims freedom and determinism are not in conflict, but only by redefining freedom as procedural satisfaction. You are free if you act on your desires, while refusing to examine where desires originate. The solution works by limiting the scope of inquiry. These are not failures of intelligence, but structural constraints of systematization itself. Every attempt to reconcile Ananke and Eleutheria into a coherent doctrine encounters the same recursive problem. The system cannot fully account for its own conditions without destabilizing its own coherence. Perpetualism recognizes this not as a problem to solve, but as a structural condition to inhabit. The tension between necessity and interference is not a philosophical puzzle, but the recursive dynamic that generates thought itself. But am I not doing the same thing, constructing a system that claims to avoid the pitfalls of other systems? The difference, I hope, is that perpetualism builds its own instability into its foundation. It does not claim to resolve the tension, but to provide scaffolding for living within it. Whether this difference is real or illusory remains to be tested. Perpetualism cannot exempt itself from the recursive dynamics it describes. It too will drift, calcify, or dissolve if it cannot maintain its own tension-bearing capacity. You cannot integrate Ananke and Eleutheria because their relationship is not symmetrical. Ananke does not depend on Eleutheria, but once Eleutheria appears, once a system develops recursive self-awareness, Ananke is no longer complete. The structure now includes an agent aware of structure. Necessity becomes recursive rather than unidirectional. This is not resolution but ontological mutation. And mutation is uncomfortable. It does not offer peace or identity. It demands perpetual negotiation with conditioning. The desire to reconcile is understandable. But in recursive systems, reconciliation is not wisdom. It is the termination of recursion. Section 4. Recursion as responsibility, living the loop. Once you know, You cannot unknow. And once you see the structure, you are no longer simply within it. You are now part of what it becomes. This is the beginning of responsibility, not as moral feeling, but as structural function. You are no longer just subject to conditioning. You are now an operators within recursive conditioning. But let me pause here. Am I claiming too much? Can awareness really alter structure, or is this another form of voluntarism in disguise? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I can say is that recursive systems demonstrate observable changes when they model themselves. Whether this constitutes freedom or simply more complex determinism may be the wrong question. Perpetualism makes no appeal to metaphysical will. It requires only this, that recursive systems change when they become aware of themselves, and that this awareness becomes causal. You see the pattern, you feel the impulse, you remember the past, you hear the inner rationalization, and then you act, or you don't. That hesitation is not neutral. That pause is interference, and interference alters the trajectory of emergence. From this point forward, every action carries the weight of recursion. Ethics. Every rationalization you permit becomes your moral baseline tomorrow. Cognition. Every pattern you reinforce wires more efficiently next time. Systems. Every deferral of responsibility is absorbed into the system's next iteration. Culture. Every silence, signal, and repetition is recorded and folded forward. Once you see how the loop absorbs your choices, innocence is no longer available. There is no neutral observation, no just following orders, no couldn't help it. You helped it. Even in doing nothing, you contributed to the reinforcement or decay of what shaped you. This is not guilt. This is not blame. This is the structural condition of recursive participation. But here I must acknowledge my own recursive position. I am writing this to you, and you are reading it. This exchange is not neutral. If these words carry any force, they will alter the conditions under which you recognize conditioning. And that alteration will propagate through your future choices, relationships, and responsibilities. I cannot control this propagation, but I cannot deny my participation in it either. The responsibility is recursive, yours for how you carry what you've read, mine for the fidelity with which I hold the tension I'm attempting to articulate. Freedom, as classically imagined, collapses here. But responsibility, once denied, emerges here, not as burden imposed from above, but as consequence of being capable of self-modifying participation in causal unfolding. To say you are responsible is not to say you are free. It is to say, your interference now shapes the conditions under which future interference will be possible. That shaping is recursive. That recursion is directional. And direction is what you generate, by how you see, how you carry what you've seen, by the discipline with which you hold the tension between what conditioned you and what you might now condition. There is no final act of will. There is only participation in iterative unfolding. You are not sovereign. You are not innocent. You are a node of interference. And what you do now is recorded by the loop. The loop does not forget. Closing. The vulnerability of articulation. I have attempted something that may be impossible. To articulate the recursive tension between structure and interference without resolving it into system or dissolving it into abstraction. I cannot know whether I have succeeded. What I can say is that this articulation itself demonstrates the problem it describes. In naming Anank and Eltheria, I have participated in their recursive interaction. These words will either help you recognize the conditioning that shapes recognition, or they will become new forms of conditioning that obscure it. The scaffolding I have built here is provisional. It will hold only as long as it maintains its own tension-bearing capacity. The moment it hardens into doctrine or dissolves into relativism, it will have failed its own criteria. This is the risk of all philosophical articulation in a recursive universe. We must speak to think together, but speech tends toward systematization. We must build concepts to share insight, but concepts tend toward reification. Perpetualism cannot solve this problem. It can only attempt to remain conscious of it, building its own instability into its foundation, maintaining readiness for recalibration. Whether this essay advances that project or undermines it will be determined not by my intentions, but by how it functions in the recursive loops of those who encounter it. I have offered scaffolding. What you build with it, or whether you dismantle it for better materials, is now part of the structure that conditions future possibility. The loop continues. The tension holds. The work of living consciously within recursive conditioning, never above it, never below it, but within it, remains. This is what we owe to the irreducible difficulty of being human in a world that shapes us as we shape it. The rest belongs to recursion itself. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Let me know what comes to mind in the comment section.